Hello and welcome to today's lecture. The topic for today's lecture is chronic process and acute process. The main objectives of our topic are the concept of acute stress and its treatment, the concept of chronic stress, health and safety risks of chronic stress, forms and treatment of chronic stress, and coping with acute and chronic stress. Stress is a feeling of being overwhelmed, worried, or run down. It is increasingly becoming a part of our daily lives. By definition, stress is any uncomfortable emotional experience accompanied by predictable biochemical, physiological, and behavioral changes. Historically, the Latin word stress has been in common language since the 17th century and was used to address hardship, adversity, or affliction. However, stress is best described as a situation where the environmental demands exceed the capacity for effective response by the individual and can potentially have physical and psychological consequences. Stress can affect people of all ages, genders, and circumstances and can lead to both physical and psychological health issues. However, an extreme amount of stress can have health consequences and adversely affect the immune, cardiovascular, neuroendocrine, and central nervous systems. Challenging life demands and tough reactions has led to the development of a number of physiological changes that constitute the stress response in animals and humans. In a hostile environment, more complex organisms like vertebrates develop a response that Walter Cannon first introduced as the flight or fight response. The main function of this response is maintaining the body's homeostasis. The key site involved in this process is the hypothalamus. In this way, the hypothalamus acts within seconds and via the sympathetic nervous system stimulates medulla of the adrenal gland and releases catecholamines, the CA, adrenaline and noradrenaline. In addition, the hypothalamus also produces chemical messengers that act more slowly and in minutes travel through the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, also known as the HPA axis. Chemical messengers in this pathway include corticotropin-releasing hormone or CRH, which stimulates the anterior pituitary gland to release another hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone or ACTH. The target organ of ACTH is again the adrenal gland, but this time it is the cortical cells that synthesize and release species-specific glucocorticoid or GC into the blood. The tight control of GC, mainly cortisol in humans, is sustained via negative feedback that controls and in the end terminates the release of corticotropin-releasing hormone or the CRH. In humans, psychological states also have a role in activating the physiological stress reaction. An individual's evaluation of a situation as stressful or not affects whether a situation evokes stress response or not. Whether a situation is experienced as stressful or not is dependent on earlier experiences, affective states, personality, available resources, and the interpretation of events. Stress occurs when there is an imbalance in terms of the actual or perceived resources not being adequate to counter actual or perceived demands. Research and theory suggest that there is a constant interplay between physiological, psychological, and environmental factors that influence whether stress is elicited or not, which, if any, stress symptoms are evoked, and how the individual reacts to stress. It is this complex interplay of multiple factors along the variation between individuals that makes it difficult to definitively explain the causes and effects of stress processes. all stress is not created equally. Stress can be mild and temporary, or it can be severe and experienced repeatedly. There are 3 different levels of stress, each of which often has its own types of symptoms: acute stress, episodic or chronic stress. Here we will only discuss acute and chronic stress. Now we are going to talk about acute stress. Sometimes we have been about to fall asleep and we jerk awake suddenly or had a near-miss collision with a bus. Those movements of sharp and sudden stress are examples of acute stress. It is the most common form of stress. This form of stress is usually short-term and specific. The cause of acute stress is often immediately apparent. Acute stress will be triggered by an imminent emotional or physical threat, such as demands on your schedule or the pressure that comes from being in an upsetting situation. Because it's short-term, acute stress does not have enough time to do the extensive damage associated with long-term stress. In most situations, small doses of acute stress are normal and beneficial. Luckily, it's easier to overcome acute stress. The symptoms of acute stress are brief jump in heart rate, increase in blood pressure, possibly followed by a tension headache, momentarily strong emotions such as anger or fear, etc. Acute stress corresponds to our organism's reactions when facing a threatening, imminent, or unforeseeable situation, such as a public presentation, an accident, a new learning experience, etc. When this stressful situation ends, stress symptoms generally stop soon afterwards. Hence, it can be useful to help us cope with a situation. Now we are going to discuss the treatment of acute stress. Most of the time, the symptoms experienced with acute stress will be brief and easily manageable. The key to acute stress management is learning how to control emotional responses. It's not about trying to stop acute stress, as it's too quick to prevent and some stress is healthy. Instead, it's about managing psychological responses to the acute stress. Stress management techniques might include sleeping away for a minute and doing breathing exercises, or taking an hour a day to practice yoga. Now we shall talk about chronic stress. Eventually, repeated stress becomes the chronic stress. It becomes the normal state of being instead of an occasional occurrence. The level of stress makes it feel as if there is nothing that we can do to make it better, and it can feel as if there is no other way out of the situation. It is, however, well understood that experiencing stresses over a prolonged period of time results in a long-term drain on body called the chronic stress. Eventually, it has a negative impact on health and may cause serious mental and physical diseases. The allostatic response is an important physical reaction that protects the body from external and internal stress. It usually decreases together with decreasing stress, and if the imbalance between spending and regaining of energy persists over a long period of time, may result in allostatic load. More specifically, allostatic load occurs when too few essential anabolic processes are taking place, which implies a lack of energy regeneration. Allostatic load is often described as wear and tear on the body that results from chronic overactivity of the allostatic system. This kind of prolonged stress is then referred to as chronic stress, which is associated with severe stress symptoms such as somatic symptoms, emotional and physical exhaustion, and sleep and cognitive difficulties. This long-term stress usually comes from life situations like an unhealthy relationship, living in a long-term poverty, or any other miserable situation. Chronic stress usually sets in when there is no way out of a situation, so trying to find out a solution to the problem is stopped and the emotional turmoil is chosen instead. People who suffer from chronic stress are most at risk for developing medical conditions related to the long-term problem and can be at higher risk of attempting suicide. The biggest problem with chronic stress is that some people can get so familiar with this lifestyle that they don't sometimes realize there is an issue until physical symptoms start to show up and their doctor brings up the idea that chronic stress could be a factor in their conditions. Now we shall discuss the health and safety risks of chronic stress. People who struggle with chronic stress can face a lot of health issues. This is partially because those dealing with chronic stress often don't take care of themselves and may share behaviors that are unhealthy, such as overeating or smoking, lung disease, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, drug and alcohol dependence, some types of cancer, suicide, accidents, significant weight gain or weight loss, stomach aches. Chronic stress and its associated symptoms eventually lead to a depletion of body's energy. The degree to which this occurs has been associated with a stage of exhaustion that carries with it an increased susceptibility to negative health outcomes, such as a heightened risk for cardiovascular morbidity, diabetes, immune suppression, and affective disorders. Chronic stress presents itself as an ongoing, open-ended problem located in the structure of the social environment. While there are many specific examples of chronic stress situations in the literature, most reflect one or more of a set of basic themes that recur as fundamental forms of chronic stress. Now we are going to discuss these forms of chronic stress. Chronic stress can occur in a number of ways. Distinguish 7 kinds of problems that suggest chronic stress. Following are the different forms of chronic stress that reflect one or more of the basic themes. The first is threats. Second, demands. 3, structural constraints. 4, complexity. 5, uncertainty. 6, conflict. 7, restriction of choice. 8, under-reward. And 9, resource deprivation. First of all, we shall discuss threats. Chronic stress is often defined by the continuing possibility or expectation of potential harm. This is the problem in such stressors as regular physical abuse by a spouse, life in a high-crime area, and life in a war zone. In these cases, the episodes of actual danger are not the entire stressor. The chronic stressor at this issue is in the constant presence of the possibility of vulnerability to dangerous forces that cannot be controlled or avoided. But these cases are only the most obvious examples in which continuing threat is the main issue. It's also the issue when a current identity is in question. For example, when a marriage is valued but also beset with continuing conflict, or when a student begins to perform poorly after developing an expectation of success. The change in grades for the student may be gradual or sudden, but the threat to one's identity as a good student accumulates only with persistent evidence of performance problems. Threat operates as a continuing reality that exists apart from realization of the threat and is a fundamental component of what is stressful about the situation. Demands. The word demands and accompanying terms such as overload are common among the most commonly used in defining the nature of stress. There's simply too much to do, and the person feels pulled by multiple independent, immediate, and uncontrollable demands that cannot be put aside. Excessive demand is at the heart of many stressful situations, but often in conjunction with other important features of chronic stress. For example, being a caregiver may have elements of excessive demand, but these situations usually also include a sense of absence of alternatives and restricted choice. Stress is usually defined to be bidirectional with respect to demand characteristics. That is, it is possible for both over-demand and under-demand to be stress problems. Structural constraints. Structural constraints include the lack of access to opportunity or the necessary means to achieve ends, or the structured reduction in available alternatives or choices. The idea of structural constraints is essential to understanding that stressors arise from and are embedded in locations in a social structure. Structural constraints come in many forms, from the influence of rules or regulations that impede dealing with a problem straightforwardly to the fact of severe and non-self-limiting social disadvantage resulting from inequality of opportunity or systematic discrimination. Restriction in access to means as a form of structural strain is a form of stress. Underreward. The notion of underreward is derived from equity theory, a theory of social exchange that posits stable social exchange under conditions of equity defined as an equal ratio of outputs to inputs for the two parties involved in a relationship. This feature of social relations has various incarnations in the sociological theory. Equity theory defines a specific condition for underreward that is quite general. In this formulation, importantly, it's outputs relative to inputs that matter, not absolute levels of outputs or rewards. The absolute problem of underreward is defined by twin notions of restriction of choice and restriction of access to means. A basic prediction of equity theory is that inequity produces distress in both parties. This feature is evocative of the bidirectional assumption underlying the effects of demands where either too much or too little is distressing. But the role of victim in equity equation is probably more universally stressful than the role of harm doer, for reasons offered by the theory. The harm doer can rationalize harm by derogating the victim without losing any outputs. Inequity is probably a prevalent form of chronic stress in that it expresses a structure of feeling unappreciated. Complexity. Complexity can be a positive feature in social life, such as when it expresses the fine points of an enjoyed or understood activity, or when it is a source of continued interest in work tasks, as in substantive complexity of work. However, complexity can also represent a form of excessive demand with its own unique characteristics. The complexity of demand is distinction from the level of demand in social roles. When demands are more contingent and yet also interdependent, the effects of the resulting complexity can amount to a form of chronic stress. People with complex jobs complain about the strain of facing constantly problematic issues without a standard or clear resolution. Complexity of routines in social roles can also be a source of chronic stress. Uncertainty. A closely related problem is uncertainty. Complexity and uncertainty usually feed each other in the following sense. At a given level of complexity, uncertainty multiplies the effects of complexity, and at a given level of uncertainty, complexity multiplies the effects of uncertainty. Uncertainty can also be a positive feature of daily life, but usually within well-known role situations or in clearly delimited amounts. Prolonged uncertainty about something that requires resolution or for which resolution is desired is itself stressful. This is a common situation in work roles where turnaround involves long periods of time or when the outcomes of tasks do not have a clear success-failure component. Conflict. It would be difficult to exclude conflict in a discussion of long-term sources of stress. Conflicts at work, in marriages, and in families become regular enactments reflecting basic differences in viewpoints, values, principles, goals, or desires. Long-term conflicts tend to be those that are defined by the inability to agree on a starting premises or even on a common goal. Both the fear of bringing the conflict to surface and the ritualized enactment of conflict become sources of chronic stress. Restriction of choice. Restriction of choice can be considered to be a kind of structural constraint. Berlin in 1983 argued for the distinct importance of restriction of choice as manifest by the problem of role captivity, or a situation in which exit from a role is desired but not really an option. When this occurs, this is likely to be a powerful source of stress captured by the phrase feeling trapped. This may be an important source of chronic stress in many lives, from the situations of caregivers to the experience of a long-term debilitating chronic illness, to a marriage that one cannot leave because of commitments to children, to the lack of alternative choices for jobs with no hope of promotion, to the absence of alternatives when your child is in a bad school. In all of these situations, it is the restriction of choice that is the source of stress over and above the stress emanating from the situation itself. Resource deprivation. Whether resource deprivation should be considered a form of stress is a controversial issue. This is a closely related concept to the notion of restriction of choice. Insufficient means or resources to achieve desired goals qualify as a restriction of choice or as a kind of structural constraint. However, what if resource deprivation has to do with resources that are important in coping with stress, such as social support? Is a state of low social support also a kind of stress? In cases when the absence of a coping resource may also define a stressful state, a choice must be made. Now we shall talk about the treatment of chronic stress. Treatment of chronic stress often involves therapy with a licensed psychologist to help to learn how to effectively deal with the common types of stress that is faced in life. In many cases, people have spent so long dealing with a chronic stressor that it takes a lot of therapy for them to see where the stress stems from, which makes the problem much harder to resolve. In some situations, chronic stress treatment can involve medicinal treatments to combat the symptoms of being stressed. While this does not get rid of the stress itself, it can help better control emotional and physical reactions to the problems that people are facing. When stress is plaguing the life, managing the stress can become a source of stress in and of itself. This is especially true when people are confused about why they are stressed and why it happens. When a clearer understanding of stress is developed, a clearer plan can be created to deal with it. Chronic and acute stresses are derived from different sources and affect different cognitive and somatic processes. For example, in regard to the physiological effects of stress, Mal in 1953 reported that gastric acid secretion occurs only in chronic but not in acute stressors. A possible explanation for this may be that reactions to threatening stimuli are heightened when subjects have time to process internal sensations. The distinction between acute and chronic stress is blurred by the fact that these two types of stress are often related. Acute stressors exert their impact on well-being and adjustment partially through the ongoing minor recurrent stressors that are the result of acute stresses. For example, parental divorce may affect children through the myriad changes in ongoing daily routines, roles, and relationships. Acute stress can also affect adjustment through cognitive processes. The significance of cognitive mechanisms in chronic stress is found in the research by Baum on the enduring effects of 3 Mile Island nuclear accident. Those residents of the TMI area who experienced high levels of intrusive thoughts and memories of the event had the most long-lasting emotional, physical, cognitive, and behavioral problems. Enduring intrusive thoughts and memories related to the accident served as a form of continued cognitive re-exposure to the stressor for a subgroup of those who lived near the TMI, creating chronic stress from a seemingly acute event. Taken together, these findings suggest that there are two processes, one exogenous and the other endogenous, through which acute events contribute to chronic stress. Exogenous processes are represented by ongoing demands and threats that are produced in the environment. For example, the diagnosis of cancer represents an acute traumatic event for patients and their families and is associated with significant short-term psychological distress. However, the enduring effects of this event are played out through the disruptions that are created in the daily routines, family roles, and threats to goals and values of the patients and their families. Endogenous processes are reflected in the persistent cognitive and affective re-experiencing of the stressor by patients and family members. Intrusive and uncontrollable thoughts and memories about the disease and reminders of it maintain appraisals of threat and emotional arousal. Involuntary negative thoughts are part of the response system that unwittingly prolongs stress. Both of these processes are the direct consequence of the effects of acute stress on the individual and the environment. The association of acute and chronic stress is not perfect, as not all acute events lead to chronic stress, nor do all individuals exposed to acute traumatic events experience chronic cognitive and affective abnormalities of these events. Further, not all chronic stressful conditions are a result of acute events, for example, poverty, a congenital birth defect, etc. Although chronic stresses are more likely to have long-term effects, those which include acute stress may or may not lead to chronic stress depending on the effectiveness of the person's coping skills. Now we shall discuss coping with acute and chronic stress. According to the literature, there are three basic models of coping and adaptation: psychodynamic, coping styles, and coping processes. The distinctions between these three areas are often buried. Indeed, all use similar terminology. Example, denial, suppression, etc. And there is often a substantial degree of overlap in the items in coping inventories. However, the three models differ in their assumptions concerning the source, development, and efficacy of adaptive strategies. First of all, we shall discuss the psychodynamic models. Psychodynamic approaches focus primarily on defense mechanisms, which are unconscious means of regulating negative affect, or primarily anxiety. According to Freud, defense mechanisms are ego processes for regulating anxiety generated by conflicts between the id and the superego that function primarily by distorting reality, whether through denial, projection, repression, sublimation, and as such are inherently pathological. Subsequent theorists expanded this list to include defenses such as intellectualization, etc. Shapiro argued that the use of certain defense mechanisms can become habitual and result in what he termed as neurotic styles. Now we shall talk about the coping styles. The second major model, coping styles, assumes that people can be characterized by a consistent pattern of coping based on perceptual styles and personality characteristics. This pattern has been described generally in terms of dichotomy, such as repression sensitization, approach avoidance, or blunting monitoring, among many others. Basically, this model holds that people can be characterized by the manner in which they process information, either approaching or seeking information, or avoiding or denying it. The third model is the coping processes. The coping processes approach assumes that coping is flexible, planful, and responsive to both environmental demands and personal preferences. Thus, researchers in this area study the cognition and behaviors of individuals in specific circumstances. Coping is assumed to derive from how people appraise the stresses they experience as to whether these entail threat, harm, or challenge. Thus, appraisals and coping strategies are not necessarily stable characteristics of the person, but arise from the transaction between environmental demands and resources on one hand and the individual's personal resources such as coping skills and values on the other. The focus of coping efforts may be the environment, problem-focused coping, or the emotions, emotion-focused coping, but the overwhelming majority of people utilize both types of strategies. The coping process is thought to unfold over time, in part as a function of changing environmental circumstances. However, people may also change their tactics based upon successfulness of their initial coping efforts. Reducing stress makes a person feel better immediately and can help protect health in the long term. In one study examining the association between feelings like happiness, joy, contentment, and enthusiasm and the development of coronary artery disease, it was demonstrated as positive emotions increase, the risk of coronary artery disease decreases. And with that, we come to an end to today's lecture. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much.